A History of Corruption, Political Incompetence, Social Division in Modern Spain, 1874-2018. I'm about halfway through, and I can vouch that it is an extremely accurate subtitle so far. It's a highly engaging read. I'm about halfway through, as I said. It's very approachable in style, but detailed and very authoritative. Now, that's quite enough from me, I think. Now over to my colleague Chris Bambury, who understands the technical side of tonight's proceedings and who will lead us through the meeting. Over to you, Chris.
Paul, I'd very much like to say that I echo how good the book is. I think I've actually read it twice now. I'm showing off. I think it's a contender of my book of the year 2020. And the first question I'd like to ask you is, I think you make it very clear at the beginning of your book that Spain was different from elsewhere in Western Europe in the sense that it didn't have the sort of change which created a state with a judiciary, a whole parliamentary democracy, etc., which could facilitate the development of industrialization. You know, what you had in Germany in 1871, Italy with the unification earlier in France, that was something missing in Spain, and it marked out Spain from the rest of Western Europe.
Yes, but one thing I would like to say, I know this sort of thing politicians do of not answering the question, so it's great to have the opportunity to do the same. Before trying to answer your very difficult question, I would like to say that one of the things that reviewers have done is to leap on the subject matter of this book to prove, as it were, or to substantiate their prior prejudice that Spain is particularly subject to corruption. And what I want to say is that, I mean, I do actually say in the book that I wrote it under the shadow of the whole Brexit debate. And if I didn't think that all political systems were riddled with incompetence and fraudulence, I certainly did as a result of that experience. And so, and absolutely, and kind of linking up with your question, yes, there were things that didn't happen in Spain in the 19th century. I mean, there was not what one would call a bourgeois revolution. There were at one level there was a legal, the end, feudalism came to an end, but actually not in a way that gave power to the industrial bourgeoisie. So power remained in the hands of the landed oligarchy. But having said that, there is so much about internal, regional conflict, militarism, colonial misbehavior. There are so many aspects of the things that happened in Spain that really do shed light on other European countries, on obviously militarism, on Germany, corruption, obviously Italy. You know, there's the lack of development, Russia, and so on and so forth. I mean, in a way, of course, it's a book about Spain because, you know, that's what I've devoted my life to, rightly or wrongly. But I've always tried to, certainly when I was teaching, to do so in a European context. And I really hope that people will read the book in a European context, in their heads anyway, and not see it as a kind of denunciation of Spain and the Spanish character.
I think that you have a point. I think Anglo-Saxons in particular are often holier than thou in saying that corruption is not something that affects our country. We should remember there have been spectacular cases. But those were missed opportunities in Spain, weren't they? You begin the book with the end of the First Republic. There was obviously the Second Republic overthrown by Franco. And then there was a transition post-Franco's death. Obviously, the last one, there wasn't, I mean, I'm not going to argue there was any continuity with Franco. There was a shift towards parliamentary democracy. But in a sense, there were missed opportunities as well.
Well, yes. I mean, clearly, one of the things I say in the book is that there is all of these features. I mean, there's kind of underlying the book what jokingly I would call a mathematical equation, which is that political incompetence plus corruption inevitably equals social division. And that is true in Spain throughout the period. I think it's true in almost every society, certainly in Europe. And so basically, we have, if you like, a couple of periods when it's not happening. I mean, corruption during the Democratic Second Republic is much more limited. It's not systemic in the same way. And in the early years of democratic Spain, I mean, modern democratic Spain, after the death of Franco, the same is true. After the spectacular, I mean, the mind-boggling corruption under the Franco dictatorship. Now, as far as the Second Republic is concerned, and obviously I'm always sort of identified as someone who's pro the Republic, and absolutely, you know, I've no doubt where my loyalties lie, although I would always say, you know, in my books, you can always see why I say what I say. They're always fully footnoted. I try to be honest. I don't believe in what the wonderful Martha Gellhorn called all that objectivity shit. You know, the BBC notion that you have to be absolutely even-handed. So does that mean one has to be, you know, even-handed between the rapist and the raped, etc., etc., etc. However, having said all of that, and if you like, nail my colours to the mast, and my colours in this case are red, yellow, and purple, the flag of the Second Republic, I would say that the Second Republic in many ways did miss opportunities, and it was because of political inexperience, and there were mistakes made. And one of the things is the great Republican project of April 1931 was something that, I mean, it was carried through by a coalition. And the problem was that the members of that coalition each had different ambitions. So the socialists, of course, wanted to see agrarian reform. They wanted to see trade union rights. They wanted to see a whole series of things that we would associate with social welfare. On the other hand, the Republicans, their liberal allies, they wanted to see constitutional reform. They wanted to put an end to militarism. They wanted to break the power of the Catholic Church. And of course, those two sets of ambitions put together were a monumental challenge to landowners, to industrialists, to bankers, to the church that controlled hearts and minds, and of course to the Praetorian Guard of all of those economic interests. So that was, if you like, why the Republic in a sense was a missed opportunity, because it was overambitious and it failed to see, or its politicians failed to see, just how sneaky and malicious and powerful were the forces that were ranged against it. Now, if we move forward to the other, if you like, missed opportunity, and it's very different, the democratic experience from 1977 was, of course, based on a transaction. Given the sheer power of the Franco dictatorship, and a dictatorship that continued to be every bit as powerful for years after the death of the dictator, it necessarily involved massive compromise. Now, having said that, I mean, that's of course left one of the pending issues that's pending to this day, the justice for the victims of the Francoists during the Civil War. But it also, I mean, despite all that, I would say it provoked great hope. I mean, I lived through all of that. I was involved in a very, very minor way. I had contact with most of the political actors and so on. At the time, I was putting together what would be a book called The Triumph of Democracy. And I was a great advocate. I still think the transition to democracy in Spain was a great achievement. I don't have a lot of time for those who dwell on the mistakes that have come thereafter. I think it was actually a minor miracle. What we couldn't foresee, and I certainly couldn't foresee, was the corruption that has undermined it thereafter. And there are so many reasons why that took place. I mean, I think one, in a way, and this is impossible to prove, if you like, empirically or in a scholarly way, I think there was an element of, after 40 years of mind-boggling corruption under the Franco dictatorship, there was an element in certain circles of, well, it's our turn now. Now, I can't prove that, but I think it is an element. And then there were mistakes made in the way of legislation, the way land use legislation. Actually, I genuinely don't think it was the intention, but it opened the way to incredible corruption. And of course, the biggest area of corruption was in the use of land. And then, of course, the thing that, if you like, drove it was the need for financing for political parties. And that is where a lot of it is centered. Although the book, I mean, I hate to say this, but some of the examples in the book of corruption in the modern period, I mean, the most recent period, are almost laughable. I mean, the occasions where we have the police searching, in one case, one of 6 estates belonging to someone, finding stables with over 100 Arab steeds, with a collection of Rolls Royces, Ferraris, and so on, huge bin bags full of cash. And when asked, how could you possibly afford all this, the guy just says, oh no, I have a good salary. I mean, some of it, as I say, it's tragic, of course, but some of it is actually quite comical. I mean, for me, the bit I enjoyed most about the book, I have to say, insofar as it was enjoyable, and it was a very painful book to write, but I did enjoy doing the part about the Primo de Rivera dictatorship in the 1920s, partly because of the amazing parallels between the dictator and Donald Trump. Of course, there was no Twitter and the like in those days, but Primo de Rivera did used to do these things called daily notes. And his daily notes, which were apparently often issued when he'd come in half shot in the early hours of the morning, are sometimes very funny indeed. And there's also the fact that when his official biography was being written, he insisted on writing the bit about his sexual prowess himself. So, as I say, there are certain parallels with Trump. And so the scale of corruption, I mean, in every way comparable with Franco, but there's a certain amusing naivety about it, that he would announce what was going on and say that that he knew that people wanted all these things for him, that that the admiration, again, who does this remind you of? That the admiration of the people was such that they wanted him to have a wonderful house, and that's why they were subscribing. Because Franco also stole from great public subscriptions. And I mean, the best bit in a way was when it came to his knowledge that there were people that, of course, a lot of their subscription was just taken from people's wages. And when this was pointed out to him as not quite kosher, he replied, or he issued a statement that if anyone objected, they could apply to have the money taken from their wages to have it returned. You can imagine what the consequences of that would have been within a dictatorship. Sorry, I'm going on too long.
You're not going on at all. There's about 32 participants at the moment. I would suggest if people want to ask a question in chat mode, and I'll bring them in, because to see 32 people waving hands, I have to keep going up and down. I can do the whole screen, but it's I would suggest you do chat. Paul, I'll let other people have a chance in a minute, but one of the things I think you're right about the book, I think there's the things on the Primo de Rivera dictatorship I learned a lot. I mean, it parallels Franco in one sense. I mean, the anti-Catalanism, the banning of the language, the banning of Barcelona Football Club, but it's kind of, as you say, it's ham-fisted. There's none of the actual terror which comes. And again, what I wouldn't say I liked in the book, but I thought you really did get across what happened in particularly July, August, September of 1936. The scale of the killings in Spain by the Francoists, though obviously by the Republicans too, but the scale of the Francoists, which is really, aside from Hitler's Germany, and we want to go into Stalin's Russia, but really, I mean, it makes Mussolini look like a child. You know, I mean, this was dramatic stuff, and it really does shape the whole Franco period to come, because you can't forget what they were trying to do here was intimidate the whole population, to terrify the population.
Absolutely, and of course, I only really touch on it tangentially in this book, because my previous big book was the Spanish Holocaust, which was entirely about this. And the key is the statement by General Mola, who was, you know, one of the at the beginning anyway, the two key generals, who said, we must exterminate those who do not think as we do. And that's exactly what it was all about. And the scale is quite unbelievable. And something I think, when people say, oh yes, but there were atrocities on the Republican side too. Indeed there were, but there were numerically, there were 3 times as many on the Franco side. And furthermore, the big difference was actually a qualitative difference, because on the Franco side, they were a deliberate and declared instrument of policy. Whereas on the Republican side, they were much more spontaneous. They took place, I'm not trying to diminish the horror, but the 50,000, I mean, what an amazing figure, but then the 50,000 murders that took place within the Republican zone took place despite the efforts of the Republican authorities to put a stop to them. And indeed, one of the reasons why the deaths in the Franco zone were 3 times as many was because of the success of the Republican authorities in putting a stop to it.
Well, you mentioned, Franco. I mean, corruption. Franco himself would like to pretend that he was this austere figure who wasn't corrupt. But I mean, he was. His family were immensely corrupt, and you detail this. And corruption was a way of he could use to police his own followers. He knew it was going on, but he also knew he could use it to blackmail them, essentially.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to say, I mean, this is how one goes on learning, and obviously I've been learning about Spain for a long time. I wrote a biography of General Franco. It took me nearly 10 years in the 1980s, came out in the early 90s. And at the time, there's a lot in it about the corruption of his family, but I naively bought a lot of the memoir material that suggested that he personally was extremely austere. My take on it at the time was Franco didn't need to steal because he thought it was already all his. And I think that's absolutely true about the national patrimony. But I was perhaps deceived by a statement in the memoirs of his sister, who was also eye-wateringly corrupt, as we now know, in which she said, you know, he was totally clean and pure. He even bought his own underpants, she declared in her memoirs. But anyway, but of course, thanks to the researches of very distinguished Spanish historians, it's been made clear in recent years the scale of Franco's personal corruption. I mentioned earlier, and I think this is in a way one of the most shocking things, the way in which great national subscriptions to help orphans, to pay for the war effort, were just diverted into his own bank accounts. When Spain was going through the terrible years of hunger in the 1940s, or particularly in the middle of the 1940s, that when the dictatorship in Brazil donated huge amounts of coffee, they were simply sold by Franco for his own benefit. So yes, I mean the corruption. We were talking about before. We mentioned briefly. I said Spain wasn't unique in its corruption, and it isn't. But the openness, shall we say? I mean, obviously it's all hidden, but what I mean is the shamefacedness is perhaps a better word of the corruption. Unlike the way in other European countries further north, it's so much more sophisticated. But anyway, that's perhaps for another day.
I would like to return to another theme which is in the book. We've got a number of people listening in or watching from Catalonia and from Euskadi, the Basque Country. I mean, again, in the book, you chart particularly the level of anti-Catalanism. I mean, I think most people would be amazed. I mean, speaking as a Scot, there has been no Catalan Prime Minister of Spain since one very brief guy in the First Republic. Now, I mean, contrasted with Scots, or indeed Welsh, there has been no, since the death of Franco in the transition, there has been no Catalan governor of the Bank of Spain. Now, again, I mean, you know, you find lots of Scots in particular, but the contrast is amazing. And just that kind of level, I mean, you're talking about Franco's internal enemies, I mean, Jews, Freemasons, communists, socialists, but Catalans, separatists, right up there.
Indeed, I mean, that's absolutely true. And it is a recurrent theme. And, you know, but we talked earlier about the fact that at the beginning of the war, the scale of atrocity was just appalling when the idea, you know, was to frighten the population into subservience. It's almost more shocking, I mean, it's not more shocking, but it's as shocking that when the war was virtually won, the scale of repression in Catalonia was unbelievable. I mean, places where there'd been hardly any resistance, it really was astonishing. Now, once the dictatorship or Franco's forces had won the war, in a way, I mean, apart from very obvious things, Catalan was prohibited, but then so was Euskera in the Basque Country. In a way, and I don't want to shock anyone by saying this, everyone who was not a Francoist in Spain was persecuted equally under the Franco dictatorship. There are moments where anti-Catalanism and anti-Basque sentiment come to the fore. And the odd thing is that as far as Catalonia is concerned, it starts again, I would say, from 2006, because of the opposition of the Partido Popular, and particularly Mariano Rajoy, the then Prime Minister, to stop the amendment to the Statute of Autonomy. But yes, I mean, there are things. I remember years ago in the centre the research centre, which I used to run when I was at the LSE. Well, I'm still at the LSE, I think, I hope. Depends on how COVID goes. But anyway, the great Catalan broadcaster, Toni Bassas, those of you in Catalonia will know what I'm talking about, came and did his morning programme, a bit like Radio 4, you know, Catalunya Radio, came and did his programme from my office. And the night before, because he had lorry loads of equipment in order to broadcast his programme from the LSE, he did this amazing seminar. And it was all sort of flashing lights and whistles and flutes, because of course he was able to project bits of video and sound about things that now are a bit more common, but were very unusual then. We're talking, I guess it must have been around about 2004, 2005. And one of the clips that he showed was of a pro-Franco journalist saying, it was during the government of the socialist government of Rodriguez Zapatero. And this guy said, well, what is it with Rodriguez Zapatero? He seems only to talk to queers and Catalans. Doesn't he know any human beings? Now, I mean, deeply shocking. The audience laughed. The audience laughed because they thought it was like spitting image. They could not believe, literally, there's 60 or 70 people in the audience, could not believe that this was the sort of thing that could be broadcast in Spain. And actually, if I recall, it was on the radio station of the Bishops' Conference. So yes, I mean, there is an underlying hatred, and it's something that is exploited for political reasons massively in Spain. I mean, the electoral benefit that came, not now, but came to the Partido Popular, and obviously Vox hopes the same will happen for them, by generating anti-Catalan feeling, it's a constant.
Coming back to that, the two surviving heroes of the transition post-Franco, Felipe Gonzalez and former King Juan Carlos, both having rather torrid times. Perhaps we could start with Felipe Gonzalez, because CIA documents just released have named him as the man in charge of the GAL death squads during the dirty war in the Basque Country. I mean, what was going on here? A socialist government employing ex-Francoists and mercenaries to kill, I mean, to murder people.
Indeed. What could I say? I mean, Felipe excused it, as it were, by talking about how much political life everywhere goes on in the sewers. But that's absolutely right. And there's nothing new about these revelations. It's been known since, I mean, certainly since the mid-90s. The judge, Baltasar Garzón, exposed it long ago. There is an amazing book about it by the Irish writer Paddy Woodworth. I mean, we've known all about this. And of course, it's a dreadful blemish on what otherwise was a great socialist career. In the case of Juan Carlos, obviously, shooting elephants, betraying his wife, collecting a huge illegitimate fortune, have also besmirched his image. I would say, however, in his case, that I don't think that retrospectively one can look at these things and let it change what he did. I don't want to get into the whole thing that's going on at the moment about what do you do with statues, about unpleasant bits of history. What do you do with statues that are to people who did very positive things, but who subsequently besmirched their image? Difficult moral questions.
Well, we shan't go there. I've got one question from one of our members. He says, Paul, it's down to education. It is, and he uses the word crap in Spain, unfortunately. Would you agree?
Well, I wasn't educated in Spain, so it's a bit difficult for me to say. I mean, the improvements, I know the university system. James Thompson, I can see up there. Hi, James. Will know as much about this as I do. Overall, I would say that the Spanish university system, that was completely decrepit, riddled with corruption, cronyism, and so on, during the Franco regime and in the early years of democracy, has been improved dramatically, in some fields more than others. Medicine, for instance, economics. Less so for reasons it would take me too long to go into in terms of history, although there are some magnificent historians operating in Spain. I think the big issue, and I hear about this through various sort of debating circles I'm in, is in secondary education. And again, in this case, I can only comment on history. And there is a lot of discontent about the fact that the curriculum doesn't really deal with some of the major issues that we've been talking about for the last half hour or so in 20th century Spain, contemporary issues, the Civil War, the dictatorship, and so on. But I don't have the wherewithal to say the education system is crap. I don't know who said it, but you know, it might be. I just don't know.
I want to come back to what you said about the PP, because here we had the situation where the Zapatero socialist government in the mid 2000s coincided in Catalonia with a socialist government, a coalition government, and we're able to. I don't want to go into the length, but we're able to come to an agreement over a new statute of autonomy, eventually struck down by the Constitutional Court, which is an interesting body in itself. I think we might want to return to. Some of us have had direct experience of the Spanish court, Hill, Jane, and myself. But as you said, I mean, the Partido Popular really took this up as an issue with which to rebuild their fortunes after the humiliation of the 2003 Madrid bombings, when they blamed ETA, when it was obvious it wasn't ETA. I mean, a government lying to its people, a Bertolt Brecht moment, actually. But they really seized on the statute of autonomy and so an anti-Catalan agenda to rebuild their fortunes, did they not?
Absolutely, and in fact, it was a very profitable. I mean, in the short term, and when I say in the short term, I mean I may be even over a decade. It was very profitable for them, and it was very profitable for them indeed up to 2017, 2018. It also, of course, triggered pro-independence feeling or policies in groups that had previously not been militantly pro-independence. I'm talking about Convergencia y Unió, the way Artur Mas, then the leader, the successor to Jordi Pujol, if you like, became almost overnight a militant, independent crusader, led, of course, to the clashes and the crisis of late 2017.
I've got a question from Hill, our chair, which is I'm asking him to unmute, and you can ask his question about. I think your microphone is not on, Hill. I think you switch your mic on.
There we go.
Hey, Hill.
I'd just like to ask you to comment on the role of the West in supporting the Franco regime during the Cold War, the survival of the Franco regime into the 70s as part of the West's broader policy, vis-a-vis the Eastern Bloc. Well,
I mean, leaving aside for a second the fact that I believe that the Cold War started in 1917, I don't share the view that it began in 1943, but obviously from 1943 onwards, both the British and the Americans were already, if you like, puzzling with the idea what they were going to do with the resurgent Soviet Union. And that was, I think that's one factor, which I'll come back to. The other was that to continue, although there were obviously powerful voices in the Labour Party in Britain and in the Democratic Party in the States, who would have liked to finish the job and see off Franco. Certainly in the UK, there was a level of war weariness that would have made, I mean, a war against Franco would have been quite difficult. And so I think war weariness was an element, but there was also a feeling that, and Franco, of course, did everything in his power to foster this feeling, that Franco could be a very valuable ally in the forthcoming clash. That, you know, and just particularly in strategic thinking in the United States, there was this feeling that when, of course, that was never going to happen, but when, in their view, the Russians swept through Germany, swept through France, they could be stopped at the Pyrenees. And Spain, which of course is geostrategically very important, you know, so a huge aircraft carrier with access to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, would be the basis for an eventual Allied strike back against Soviet Russia. That was the thinking. And of course, Franco, again, something I go into in enormous detail in my book about Franco, it's something that he played on very skillfully. And of course, he was already preaching to the converted, if you like.
Mike wants to ask a question privately. How much do you think the transition and lack of fundamental changes to the legal system has impacted the current climate of perceived lawfare and the imprisonment of Catalan politicians?
So I didn't quite get that. Say this again.
Asking about how much do you think the transition and lack of change to the legal system has impacted on the current climate of perceived lawfare and the imprisonment of Catalan politicians?
Well, I mean, obviously, well, first of all, I need to clarify. I'm not sure whether you see the Spanish Constitution that was agreed in 1978 as having total continuity with the Francoist legal system. I don't think that's the case. However, it is certainly the case that over issues like regional autonomy, it has some very draconian conditions which were accepted by all parties. I mean, again, I go into detail about this in the book, what the votes were in terms of local and national referenda and so on. But it is an ironclad situation that the text of the Constitution does not allow any region to hold a referendum on its independence from the central state. And the only way, according to the Constitution, that could be done is by way of a national referendum. Well, obviously, in a national referendum, the people who've been, if you like, fired up to hate Catalans are not going to vote in favour of Catalan independence. So the answer has to be, in my view, and you know, call me a wimp, in my view, has to be constitutional reform. And I think that, you know, given the distribution of forces, you know, independent, you know, declarations of independent autonomy are always going to lead to clashes that it is very difficult to see the autonomy in question, in this case Catalonia, actually winning. Not least given the context of the European Union, which is not going to, despite the, I think, the vain hope that the European Union will stand by or would stand by an independent Catalonia. I don't think it's unearthly of that, because of, you know, the desire to, well, first of all, not to lose Madrid, not to offend the French vis-a-vis their various potential autonomous regions. You know, the list is endless in a way, you know, Belgium, Flanders, etc., etc., etc. So the answer has to be, and I know that, I mean, I know this is, it's a hard row to plough, as it were, has got to be constitutional reform. And that means avoiding confrontation and trying to persuade minds and hearts. And that, God knows, is not easy in a world of Twitter, Facebook, and, as in this country, a predominantly right-wing press.
Jane from the APPG would like to ask about the role of the judiciary, and particularly the fact there are political appointed judges in Spain involved in very major things, the Constitutional Court, the Audiencia Nacional, the Supreme Court, etc. I mean, and it's become an issue, certainly. I mean, certainly in Catalonia, it's highlighted, but I don't think it's just in Catalonia. Across Europe, there has been some concern about the independence of the judiciary in Spain.
Sorry, did you say James?
I'm asking about political appointed judges.
Yeah. No, I get it. Sorry, I thought you were going to say that James was going to come in. I can see him there, but he's been muted. He should fight back more virulently. Anyway, here he is, okay. But the point is, I think, yes, I mean, there are liberal judges, but in the main, the way it's rigged, well, rigged's probably too strong a word, but I mean, the system heavily favors political appointees. And in that sense, I mean, this is way, you know, this is above my pay grade. It's beyond what I know about. But my guess is it's much more like the system in America. And of course, it inevitably exacerbates problems. But that's really all I can say.
Well, that leads me into hi to everyone from Anonymous. Can you talk about the corruption from the main parties in Spain since the transition, the Socialists, the PP, Convergencia in Catalonia, and how it's affected the evolution of Spanish society and the economy?
Well, I mean, obviously, leaving aside human nature, there are two issues here. On the one hand, sorry about this, I'm getting terrible cramp in my leg. So if I suddenly disappear and scream, you know what it is. There are two issues I think I mentioned earlier. One is the need to finance parties, the need for electoral funds. And what happened with both the socialists, well, I suppose it happened to all three. It happened to the socialists, it happened to the Partido Popular, and it happened to Convergencia, that the need to finance led to corruption, different in different parties. Obviously, most recently in the PP, we had the whole Gürtel thing. In Catalonia with Convergencia, we had the 3%, the 3% levy on public works and so on. And certainly in the case of the PSOE and the PP, my take on it is that those involved who were handling considerable sums of money thought, well, why not pass a little bit into my own bank account? I mean, I quote in the book a telephone conversation that was tapped by the police of a Valencian politician who actually said, we've got to do this because I need a new car and I've got an eye on a Jaguar. And indeed, I happen to know he bought the Jaguar. But so that's one factor. The other was, as I said earlier, were the changes in the legal situation regarding land zoning. That when it became possible for, say, a small town municipality to change the use of land from, say, agricultural land to domestic housing, that opened the way to bribery to do this. And it grew on the most monumental scale. Again, the last 20 or 30 pages of the book is all about this. So I think they were the two reasons. Now, what effect did it have on the population at large? Well, that's a really difficult question to answer because there were lots of polls about this, and people were asked, for instance, why, as evidence of the corruption of the PP came out, why did they keep voting for the PP? And the general answer seemed to be a shrugging of the shoulders. No, well, they're all the same. Now, when corruption in the Socialist Party in the late 80s came to light, the villain of the piece being the brother of the deputy of the party, Felipe González, deputy Alfonso Guerra, his brother Juan, that actually did serious damage to the Socialist Party. But evidence of corruption seems not to have done much in the way of damage to the Partido Popular, or did not do damage to the Partido Popular in the years as evidence about Gürtel was coming out. Then, of course, when it did come out fully, then it led to the collapse of the party.
Frances asked about leading on from that. We had the financial collapse of 2008, a subprime situation in Spain, very similar to the United States. You had then austerity measures and an economic recession. He's asking, did this feed into the rise of nationalism, particularly the austerity measures that were implemented under Rajoy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just as one might argue that, austerity, when twisted by skillful media, is what was behind the Brexit vote, the same thing, it would be absolutely fair to say that the austerity policies, of course, had impact all over Spain in different ways, but in Catalonia, unfortunately, as implemented by Convergencia y Unió, which, let us not forget, is a conservative, or was, doesn't exist anymore, was a conservative party, that austerity, obviously and rightly blamed on the central government, was a major factor in the growth of independentismo, of independent sentiment. Interestingly, I would say that the great leap towards independentismo by Artur Mas was in part to try to cleanse himself of the stigma of austerity. So yes, austerity in so many ways plays a key role in the I wouldn't say the rise of nationalism, but the intensification thereof. And the fact that it didn't happen in the Basque Country is, of course, because the Basque Country had control over its own finances. And by comparison with almost everywhere else in Spain, the incidence of corruption in the Basque Country is relatively minimal.
Going back historically, Mark Pujol asked about the chapter about the disaster in Morocco, Battle of Annuel, and the corruption which is going on there with, this fascinating character, people haven't heard of him, Juan March, involved in selling, with the military, selling weapons to the Moroccan rebels. I'm trying to think of examples. There's lots of corruption in Britain, but I can't remember the British Army ever actually selling weapons to the rebels. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I don't know enough about British colonial history, so I wouldn't venture an opinion on that. But certainly, it was, the level of corruption at the African Army, or as it was called, El Ejército de África, was amazing. And Juan March is one of the central villains of the book, and his corruption can be found in every period. Rigging judges, having people murdered, financing. The major, and certainly initial major financer of Franco's war effort. The corruption of Juan March really is eye-watering, particularly the way in the late 40s he manages effectively to steal the huge electricity generating company in Catalonia, the Canadiense. But having said that, the selling of weapons to the enemy, to the natives, the rebel tribesmen, was done largely by senior officers in the army, and the level of corruption on every scale, starving the men of food and uniforms and so on, while funds were put into the pockets of officers, was all exposed, initially by the great socialist Indalecio Prieto in a series of newspaper articles. Unfortunately, unlike most socialists, he happened to own his own newspaper. He exposed what was going on, and then in response to him, there had to be a great investigation known as the Picasso report, done by a general who was distantly related to Pablo Picasso, the painter. And the Picasso report eventually, to prevent its results or its conclusions being implemented, was what largely why a military dictatorship was established in 1923. So yes, I mean the corruption and therefore the consequent incompetence, military incompetence, of the Spanish army, very, very closely linked.
I just want to come back to something you mentioned about the legacy of the Franco regime. One of the victims of the coronavirus in Spain was a guy called Billy the Kid, El Niño, who'd been a torturer under Franco, and then had stayed until 1981. And he died before a case brought by some of his victims, one of whom died as well of coronavirus, could be brought to conclusion. This man was actually decorated by Martin Villa, one of the interior minister in the first democratic government. But I mean, it's not the case, but it's just the fact that, these people, and I think the fabulous Catalan author Montalban said, the same people are still there. He was talking about just after the people who tortured me are still there. They're still in position. I mean, there wasn't a purge, was there? There was no purge.
Oh, no, absolutely not. But again, let me throw a question back to you. Are you surprised?
No.
I mean, look at what's going on with police forces all over the place. Now the things that are coming out with Black Lives Matter, it is very difficult. Very difficult. Who will undertake this job, and that is the problem. And of course, the death of Billy the Kid has led to great rejoicing in certain circles. But he was already retired, of course. But of course, and it goes back to what we were talking about before about Felipe and what goes on in the cloacas in the sewers. Governments, we don't always know, but we know that many governments use individuals like this to protect themselves. It's vile, it's disgusting, it's regrettable, but quite what we as ordinary citizens can do about it, I'm not sure.
Right, I've got various MPs here, I've got an MEP here, I've got academics. I've never known such a silent audience. Please type up, just text something, I'd like to speak, that will do. Stop me firing away. I mean, I just want to come back. I did think as well, the book had to touch on, in a way, in modern Spain, and this is not unlike Britain, so I'm not getting my high horse, but there's a very close connection between finance and politicians, particularly finance. And there's a kind of revolving door, not dissimilar from what we have here, between the Bank of England, the Treasury, and back to the individual banks. But there is a very close relationship between the two main political parties and, if you like, the new sort of financial industrial elite in Spain.
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure what you want me to say. And there's, again, the detail of this isn't really my speciality. I mean, this is the kind of thing you need to ask investigative journalists who are following the situation day by day in Spain. I mean, oddly enough, I would say I know more about this in Britain than I do about it in Spain.
I think that's a good reminder that, I mean, one of the things that also strikes me about reading the book is that I know Italy very, very well. And corruption is rife, but its base is basically an organized crime, which of course has penetrated into the state and the political system. But in Spain, it would seem to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that it's not so much organized crime, which exists there as anywhere, but it's mainly within the, as you described, the institutions of the state. I mean, local government and the whole lands, the whole bubble of the building, and prior to the bust in 2008. Would I be right in saying that?
Well, I think so. I mean, there is no real equivalent in Spain of the mafia, although there are parts of the eastern coast where it is said that the Russian mafia is very powerful, but generally there is no equivalent in Spain of the mafia, and corruption is generalized. And as I've now said several times, it's partly to do, I mean, it's partly it's embedded in the political system because it's partly to do with, or it begins with the need to finance parties electorally, and then it all then links up with the whole issue over land rezoning and so on. And then, of course, so many people get involved. What does become striking is the fact that traditionally, I mean, if you read books about 19th century Spain, or indeed, Gerald Brennan who always talks about Spaniards being very careful about not flaunting wealth and so on, keeping it to themselves, being discreet and so on. In my book, I have these mind-boggling cases of people with their own zoos and the largest collection of wild animals, in the Western world. Large fleets of Rolls Royces, Ferraris, and the like. But it is. It's much more embedded it's much more systemic, and I mean, obviously, you'd have to be crackers to say it's nothing to do with organised crime, but it's that's when they can get a look in. I think the politicians don't give them much of a look in.
Bent from Sweden points out that, as in England and Spain, there's the same revolving door, which is takes us off somewhere else. But I think it's probably true. Ronnie Cowan, MP from Inverclyde. Ronnie, do you want me to ask it, or can I bring you in? Hold on 1 second. I've got to find Ronnie. He's quite there.
I'm in.
Okay, on you go, Ronnie.
I was just wondering there, Paul, as a historian, I always believe we should learn from history. So as a historian, what do you think the future of Spain will look like maybe over the next 10 to 20 years?
You've asked me as a historian to pretend to be a fortune teller. And, I have enough problems trying to interpret the past. I mean, even bigger ones trying to interpret the present. So trying to talk about the future, I mean, really is a mug's game, because who knows what's going to happen with COVID-19? Who knows what's going to happen when Britain has been reduced to 4 insignificant, independent states or autonomous states on the fringes of Europe, with starvation rife, food riots. When COVID-19 meets Brexit, who knows what will happen? Certainly not me.
That's a cheery thought. Joseph Wilty asked, I think you mentioned earlier corruption was a relatively minor problem in the Basque Country compared to the rest of Spain. What are some of the reasons for this disparities in level of corruption between the Basque Country and the rest of Spain?
Well, basically because because of the autonomous financial arrangements in the Basque Country. It's really an odd thing in a way, why why there is so much more hostility on the part of Madrid to Catalonia than there is towards the Basque Country, and yet, Basque nationalism in the form of ETA committed atrocities and so on. And I think there are 2 things going on here. On the one hand, there's almost a kind of, and this is again something I absolutely can't prove, it's not the sort of thing I should be saying in public, but it's almost a sense, those Basques, you don't muck around with them, and they're just like us. Whereas the Catalans are thoughtful and cultured and so on, and therefore not like us. The Basques, they're feisty bastards. You don't cross them lightly. So I think there's an element of that. But there's also, and partly because of that, it's extraordinary actually. During the Civil War, the hatred that emanated from the Francoist High Command against the Basques was very much on a par with the hatred towards the Catalans. I mean, when you study, as I have in great detail, the destruction of the town of Guernica and the things that were said by officers and why this needed to be done and why Basque nationalists needed to be exterminated, all of that. what is really extraordinary is that at the end of the war, Franco granted the Basques the permanence of the economic concordat, if we call it that, that had existed since since at least the 1870s, and that survived into the democratic period. Oddly enough, and this is extraordinary, the and the details, I'm not sure I can remember them exactly, but the Catalans in the Jordi Pujol was given the opportunity to adopt a system similar to the Basque one, and for understandable reasons, against its sort of mathematical calculations, he decided against it. And that, of course, in the long run, saw Catalonia unable to enjoy the benefits that the Basques did. It may also be, I just don't know, because you tempted me into making comments about national character. The Basques are very fervently Catholic in a way that, I don't know. I mean, there's a contradiction there, because very often when people say to me, why do you think Spaniards and Italians are more prone to corruption than Germans or Swedes? I tend to say, it's because they're Catholics. And I speak as a retired Catholic myself. I took early retirement very early on in life. But I mean, the great thing about Catholicism is, confession and absolution. And I think, and again, not something I could prove, but I think that's a factor in corruption in Spain and Italy.
I would like to ask a question.
Can I just say, it's getting very near my bedtime.
Okay, we're going to finish by in 10 minutes maximum.
Right.
I'm sure if we can't go to the pub, of course, but I'm sure we could all raise a glass quite soon. I wanted to just ask one question, right back to really the very origins of the Spanish state. I mean, it was a Castilian state, what becomes the Spanish state. The very original creation of the Kingdom of Spain and the evolution of it. It was centered on Castile. It involved the exclusion of others from the very beginning, Muslims and Jews. And that Castilianism has never quite left it. It's, very, as I mentioned, there's no Catalan prime minister, there's no Catalan back, but the Castilianism of the Spanish state is still there. You make the point that, for instance, pre-Civil War, there were very, very few Catalan or Basque army officers. This was a Castilian force in essence.
Yes, that's true. But again, I'm not sure I can say much other than, yes, I agree. There are oddities, for instance, why is Gallego, Galicia, which, when people talk about the regions that, sorry, I'm going back on myself. When the Statutes of Autonomies was introduced in the late 1970s, it, of course, in order to dilute autonomy from the real historic nationalities, as they're called, it gave autonomy to 17 what were described as nationalities. And it baffles me how, I'm probably going to insult someone, but how can you compare La Rioja, leaving wine aside, how can you compare La Rioja to Catalonia or the Basque Country? And the four great historic nationalities, I suppose you could say five if you include Andalusia, but usually they're the ones with different languages and culture. Now, Galicia, which as I'm sure you all know, has a language which is somewhat akin to Portuguese, because it's such a poor region, has always been deferential to the central government. So it's not been a threat. We've talked about, obviously, the Basque Country with its own language and culture, Catalonia much more so, with an incredibly rich culture, are perceived as enemies, perceived as subversive. Valencia is an odd one. Why is Valencia, again, with its own language, which doesn't use very often, but certainly Valencia is a language very similar to Catalan. Now we get into really murky territory. Is it a dialect of Catalan? I always like to say, of course, that when talking to French people, that French is a dialect of Catalan. Oddly enough, they seem to take offense. But anyway, Andalusia, of course, very much has its own culture, but it's a culture that is seen as quintessentially Spanish. All of the sort of tourist icons, flamenco, castanets, bullfighting, you know, these are all Andalusian. And of course, there have been plenty of Andalusian prime ministers and Andalusian generals. And oddly enough, they've also been playing, Franco's a Gallego, there have been numerous Gallego prime ministers, Rajoy most recently. So what you say is true, but I think it's most true when it comes to the exclusion of Catalans and to a lesser extent of Basques.
One of my friends, Michael Urd, has just written a book about Valencia, Sail and Wind, and he quotes a Valencian writer saying, I speak Catalan in a Valencian way. And I noticed Winston Kwesi Johnson was on today for a PEN award. Winston Kwesi Johnson speaks English in a Caribbean way. So I think it's an interesting minefield of linguistics, but it's something well. Right.
Well, when I'm in Valencia with Valencia parlant, with people who speak Valencian, we understand each other. I talk to them in Catalan, throwing in Valencian words when I know them. They talk to me in Valencian, and not the slightest problem. That's great. I mean, one of my great regrets, coming as I do from Liverpool, is never speaking Welsh. I'll tell you why. Because I support Everton, and when I was a young football supporter, the people around me in the ground in Goodison Park were all talking Welsh. And but anyway, and I'm not just sucking up to Huel here, but anyway, language is a wonderful thing, and it's one of the most awful things about Britain, that there is this contempt for languages, that the education system does not recognize the pleasures and the empowerment that speaking languages gives us all, or gives us those who make the effort. And I think that's one of the most wonderful things about Spain, that there are all these languages, and it's a pity, it's such a pity that they've actually become weapons of war rather than weapons of cultural understanding.
Well, I saw Hill laughing there. One of the discussions I remember I was having was in the late 19th century.
It's probably going to turn out that Huel supports Liverpool, but we won't go there.
A serious discussion of making Liverpool the capital of Wales.
Sorry, you're talking to me or to Hill?
Well, I'm just pointing out that Liverpool was a serious contender for being the Welsh capital before they finally plumped for Cardiff. I mean, it was a...
Really? I didn't know. I mean, I always knew that Liverpool was the capital of Ireland, but I had no idea. I mean, the Scouse accent, which of course I have not lost despite living for 50 odd years away from Liverpool, the Scouse accent is an exact mix of a Dublin accent and an Aberystwyth accent.
It's not Liverpool, of course, Paul. It's Lerpwl, or even Llynlleifiad, if you were being literary in the 19th century sense.
Are you a northerner? You're not from Cardiff, I take it.
No, for Carnarvon, the other end of the country.
All right, okay.
Almost
Has anyone got a final point they'd like to raise?
Yes, go on.
Anyone? Well, Paul, I'd very much thank you for this. I think it's been very illuminating. I really would recommend, I've emailed out a link to those who are on the email list, a link where you can buy the book online. I'd prefer it if you bought it from a bookshop or a book dealer's rather than from Amazon. They get more money that way. I would also encourage you to support the All Party Group on Catalonia in a financial way if you can. You can go on our website, take out a direct debit, that would be most welcome. But above all, I would like to thank Paul Preston, who is one of the, I don't know if this is the final point I'd like to ask you about. Why is it that so many English-speaking historians, so many great English-speaking historians of Spain? I mean, why? I know there are very good Spanish historians, but it is particularly striking that, you know, Spain, the best historians in Spain in some ways of an English-speaking world.
Well, let's not forget that there are fantastic British historians of Germany and Russia and Italy and France. I mean, I think really the question is more to do with why, and maybe it's to do with colonial history. I mean, oddly enough, it's only Britain and America, well, I say only, I don't want to be too categorical, but Britain and America, or the education systems in Britain and America, or the universities in Britain and America, have produced quite a lot of historians of other countries. And that's not something, you know, there are hardly any French historians of other countries, hardly any Spanish historians of other countries, and I could go on. It may be something to do with the colonial past, thinking that, you know, we rule the world, I don't know. Oddly, having said what I've just said, there are hardly any good American historians of Spain. But there you go. There you go. On that. Oh, the one thing I want to thank everybody for putting up with me, and I do hope you'll erase all of this because I'll probably lose my job for most of the things I've said.
Well, unfortunately, I've recorded it. So if you send a check made out to Chris Banbury, I might delete it.
Well,
but Paul, I seriously would encourage everyone to buy the book. I think it's a superb work. And I'm not just saying that I think it's a really important book. I'm pleased it's been translated into Castilian. I hope it gets translated into Catalan, actually, because I think people need to
it already has. It already has. It came out in Catalan last November.
Right. Well done. Maybe Basque will follow, but that's more difficult.
No, next is Chinese, I think.
Well, there you go.
Bizarrely.
It's a deserved book, and I think it really is absolutely worth reading. Really worth reading. And I'd like to, as are all your other books. So I'd really like, on behalf of us all, to I'm going to ask if everyone can give a round of applause for Paul for that contribution.
Thank you. Thank you.
And wherever you are, in North America, in Scandinavia, Catalonia, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, I mean, that's where we have people from tonight. I really hope you stay safe and keep well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.